As a group, we would like to acknowledge that the land on which this podcast was produced is within the unceded and traditional territories of the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose relationship with the land continue to this day. We would also like to give thanks to all the ancestors, supernatural ones, hereditary leaders, matriarchs, and creatures big and small for looking after the rich resources and cultural teachings of this beautiful land. We ask you to take a moment to appreciate and give thanks to the land on which you stand as well. Thank you.
I think it's just like we're only in the beginning stages of the conversation of like, we need to talk more about mental health. Okay, I think we've talked a lot about mental health. We're there. We're here. We're there. Okay, now we need the resources. Now we need things that we can actually do. Okay, we've acknowledged mental health as an issue.
I'm your host, Krista, and welcome back to Let's Talk Access, a podcast mini-series focused on exploring access to mental health services in the Victoria, BC area. On our final episode this season, you'll hear us talk about our experiences accessing services as we share our circle audio. Up until we had had this conversation, we hadn't had a chance to share our experiences with each other. In episode 2, we heard Tamara, Sierra, and Joe's solo recordings. Today, we're going to hear from everyone. When we got together, it turned out that Becca and Natasha had also gone out and tried to access services. This wasn't planned and really cool. We had so much to say, I actually completely forgot to share what I had accessed. Seeing as one of our laws was not leaving anyone behind, I'm going to do that quickly now. I've been doing a lot of somatic experiencing and EMDR throughout the making of this podcast to complement other therapeutic work I've done over the last 10 years. If you haven't heard of those models before, I'd give them a quick Google search. They're both pretty powerful and different ways of working with trauma. I shared at the beginning of the podcast that over the last 2 years, my life has been changed pretty dramatically, and it's been a tumultuous time up until this point. So while I've been in the field for a while and receiving support for equally as long, I experienced a brand new level of PTSD these last 2 years. I'm really happy to say that while it's been incredibly challenging, especially with the added difficulty of isolation and the uncertainty that a pandemic can bring, the therapy I chose for myself is making huge shifts in areas I've been struggling with for a long time. Sometimes that's what happens. We're functioning well enough on our own until we hit a few major roadblocks and all of a sudden, we need help. And that can be a really hard place to be in. Honestly, I think over these 2 years, many of us have gotten there, and shame stops a lot of us from getting help, and maybe the fact that it can be really hard to tell what's happening. So that's what you won't hear from me because I forgot to share it, but I think it's important that you know that. I also think it's important that I talk a little bit more about how we had this conversation, because we didn't just show up and start talking. David taught me safe and functioning groups have 3 laws: a common goal, leadership, and no one left behind. For this episode, we're going to focus on that last one of nobody left behind because it's important to understand so you can really picture what was happening. We met in a virtual circle, something that 2 years ago I didn't think would be really possible because I believed you couldn't capture that same experience of in person, online. Turns out it's not the same, but I was also wrong. The experience was still pretty contained, and here's why. When David would talk about not leaving anyone behind, he'd also say another way of expressing that was moving as fast as the slowest person. What I would end up learning is that that 3rd law is really about sewing people into a space, allowing them the freedom to continue growing and changing, and always in a way coming back to them, and them coming back to the containment of the circle. That all sounds pretty metaphorical, but here's what I mean. When people come together to have an experience and work on something, you can't assume they all have the same tools, knowledge, or experiences. So you start at the foundation and you build the common tools, knowledge, and experiences up together. This process of going out, trying to access services for the purpose of critically thinking about them, and then coming back to reflect on it was a brand new experience for all of us. We all climbed into that boat together with different beliefs and tools, and then we came back to clarify and talk about them out loud. No one assumed anything. They shared and discovered universals. The fact that no one had had these experiences before meant this was a new journey we all set out on together, and we built up the knowledge and tools at the same pace. But we also structurally met together in a way that made sure we left no one behind. We left no one's voices behind, and we repeatedly carved out individual time for each person to reflect on their experiences. We also helped to not leave anyone behind by giving people the chance to mentally process. Think about it. We've all been in a class, activity, or party where someone was talking about something and we reacted or started thinking about something else. Maybe that's already happened in this podcast. But you start to float away, continually coming back to each person and letting them process what has happened up until that point. It's a way of drawing them back in. There's quite a few bits of audio from that circle that you won't hear today. We did that so we could protect our privacy while we were recording together, and so that everyone was comfortable enough to share without worrying about censoring themselves. What you'll hear is vulnerable and unscripted. We all signed on that night, most of us with our dinners, and got comfortable and ready to share. Matilda, Tamara's hedgehog, was also there. We started with a general check-in, going around and hearing how people were doing and anything mentally that might have been keeping them out of the conversation that night. And then we each took turns getting into things. I asked some questions, and as we listened, more sharing happened. We started to realize we'd all had similar experiences and internal barriers come up. Now you're going to hear from Becca, Natasha, Tamara, and Sierra, and Joe as we dive into the audio.
In this circle, we are one human race, and we'll come to sit together to pray in ceremony, and they'll know we were here by our love, and they'll know we were here by our love.
Becca surprised us by starting the conversation off. You'll remember that I mentioned our creative team took the opportunity to also go out and try to access services. She gave us insight on her experience in headspace during an intake call with a local organization.
I've been at this place before. There you go. And so I kind of knew what I was going to. I just needed something. So I went to them. Yeah, and the receptionist, lovely lady on the phone, lovely person on the phone, very calming voice. I think just the questions were like I'm like, I just need to give you my phone number, that I want to talk to someone, and please can we do it soon? Not what do you need counseling for? Because I'm like, I don't want to tell you that right now in my life, and that's why I started crying. Like, that's my whole problem. I can't tell anybody how I'm feeling. That's why I need someone to listen to me. Gosh. Anyway, yeah, that's I got my intake appointment pretty quick. So that's exciting. So hopefully they'll go quickly that way. Yeah.
I asked her how she felt about reaching out.
I've been dragging my feet for a long time.
I asked what she thought had been getting in the way, and she started giggling, and this is what she had to say.
I'm fine. What do you mean? I don't have time for this right now. A lot of that. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll just go watch anime. I'll be fine.
That's already all sounding pretty familiar. I asked her what was behind her decision to reach out to a service she's been with before, and this is what she said.
Yeah, I think it got to the point where I was like, the familiarity, if I don't do it here, I'm not going to do it anywhere else. So I was like, if I don't go to this, I won't do it at all. So, like one of those desperate moments.
I think many of us know what that feels like, but we haven't all had the opportunity or experience of finding something that's worked well for us in the past. Trying to find that when you're already feeling desperate can really be challenging. Next, we'll hear from Natasha.
So similar to Becca, I had been wanting to access services for a while and had been continually putting it off, not on purpose.
How many of us haven't done that?
And I think I had been wanting to access, mental health services since I first met Krista in 2015, and just kind of continually put it off because just took on more and more things. We started recording this podcast, and then, my mental health kind of plummeted quite quickly. So I called the Student Wellness Center, was kind of just expecting to, make an appointment for some time. And they actually told me, oh, we have openings in, 30 minutes.
She's going to mention something now that we didn't hear in Becca's audio, how talking about what you're struggling with can be exhausting.
Again, similar to Becca, I don't like talking in my downtime. When I'm in my downtime, I like to zone out, and I live in my body and I live my experiences, and I don't want to really talk about it. I find that exhausting to just re-story all the trauma, or even just to talk about my day. Nah, I don't wanna. I think it was just kind of the thing. I'm really glad I'm seeing her, and great entryway into therapy, I think, and just getting used to it maybe. And maybe in the future, I might want to find someone who's a little more fine-tuned to exactly what I'm concerned about and what I'm trying to work on. But really nice that service was available. Lot faster timeline than I was thinking, couple hours within when I called. Was not expecting that.
Besides getting through quickly, I asked if anything surprised her about her experience.
For me, what was surprising is that it's so hard to get out of the mindset. And this is part of why I find it really exhausting to go and try to find help, is because I've analyzed and thought about myself and then what people are going to say to me about what I'm going to say.
At this point, everyone's head is shaking in agreement. I ask if they want to share.
It just resonated, because I'm the same way. Like, I will think about stuff and all that kind of thing, and I've already got like half a solution before I speak to somebody. And I'm really specific, like when I'm trying to access things. I don't know if this was Natasha's experience or not, but I'm like, that's not what I'm looking for. And yeah, and sometimes it gets really frustrating, because I also have a really hard time expressing that really clearly. So then it just becomes like a muddled mess. And then I'm just like, no, and I shut down, and that's it.
Sierra shares next.
I have been having mental health struggles for a very long time. And in that time, I have been bounced around a lot of different services for 1 or 2 appointments. And then after you've done all that bouncing around, it gets really frustrating that you almost just like want to take it into your own hands and do your own learning. And like basically I found myself Googling like CBT skills, DBT skills, like therapy in your own home, like do it yourself. And then at that point too, I get so in my head of like both feeling what I'm feeling, thinking about what I'm feeling, thinking about what I'm thinking about what I'm feeling, and then psychoanalyzing myself at the same time. And then thinking about what the counselor's thinking about me as well, but like also
so
like
much work.
Welcome to my brain. I don't know if that resonates with you, Natasha, but that's how I feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to go like this and actually push my lips closed, because boy, I interrupt people a lot. Yes, that's exactly what I was getting at, and probably prancing around with my words and not actually saying.
Tamara jumps in.
To connect to what Sierra and Natasha and Joe were all saying about like this meta-analysis of what you're doing. All the time you're being asked, and the big one that I have to work on every day is how to decolonize my brain and like take apart what I'm thinking. And it was really this concept of decolonizing that I've now branched off into a whole bunch of things that I don't like about my thought patterns, and the internalized shame I feel about my anxiety and my OCD, and talking about it, and especially talking about it to someone that it feels like someone is, every sentence you give them is another clue for a diagnosis or a solution. So it feels valuable to hold on to those thoughts. And so sometimes it's easier to keep them all in and to break it all apart yourself and then put it back together the way you want.
Sarah, what about you?
For me, I've had to do a lot of my own pre-diagnosing as well, of like having symptoms and then have doctors not take it seriously, and then trying to figure out what those symptoms are and what they relate to. So then you're like even thinking harder about like, am I actually feeling this, or am I making up it in my head? Or is this actually happening, or what do I do?
That's a really big one for me. Am I just making this up? Am I just being really sensitive? I mean, I grew up with that where people were telling me I was imagining things, and, I got off into the big wide world and it turned out I wasn't imagining very much. But I catch myself still now really questioning, like it took me 2 years to recognize that I've been experiencing PTSD. Like I had complex PTSD, but that really was triggered, and that's what was going on. And I had such an incredible amount, and still do, but it's decreased a little bit, an incredible amount of shame attached to not being able to manage my reactions, and being somebody who's so educated and smart in this area and not being able, it felt like, to stop myself. And the amount of criticism and judgment that I was receiving, it just was like very stigmatizing. And knowing that going in and needing to ask for exactly what I wanted, but I didn't know that, up until a little while ago when I finally, my brain calmed down enough to be able to piece those things together.
There was a lot shared there. I shift gears and asked Natasha about something she'd mentioned earlier, that for once she was going to let someone else come up with the plan.
How was that for you to do that?
It's very hard, actually. Even when I said it, I was like,
I think we heard
body. Did you? I'm not surprised. I told my physiotherapist that as well the last time I saw them. I said, I'm in your hands. I didn't change your treatment plan. I did it. And she was surprised too and said, that sounded like that was really hard for you. And I was like, yeah, it's very hard for me. I've always had very high standards for myself, and I've always liked to have complete control over everything.
I think a lot of us can relate to that. Next, I asked Tamara about her experience.
Well, if you are to take a look at the titles of a lot of my recordings, it starts with frustration. Because I am frustrated. That's why I am frustrated, because I think it is absolutely ridiculous that I am in like one of the most privileged positions of my life, and therapy is still out of reach, like financially. And if I want to have therapy, yes, I have to give up something else in my life, which is for me is fine because I see a lot of value in that. But I don't think you should have to give anything up to also have your brain work the way you want it to work. I found for me, the things that were the most helpful were the things that I was already doing in my class with my students. Like every day we do a meditation and manifestation. Every day we check in about our feelings. I found being with them and talking about it with them made me feel better. It makes me think, like, why don't we have a setup for the adults inside of this building? Why is there a dedicated counselor for all of these kids? And like, we jump through so many hoops for these children, which I'm happy to do, but we don't stop and take a look at what is happening and what sacrifices are being made by these adults in this building. It's a diamond model as opposed to a triangle, right? So instead of having the kids at the top, and then you've got the teachers to support the kids, and then you've got the admin in the district to support the teachers, and then you've got XYZ, and we're building up. Instead, we've got the kids at the top, and then we've got this big chunk of teachers, and then there's basically no support. Like, Good admin will support you a bit, but they can't do a ton because they've got like 15, 16 classes to manage at an elementary level only. And then it's one of those things where it feels really frustrating and like nobody's taking the time to sit and observe and help and support, because it feels a lot of the time like people are looking into the fishbowl, and as they pass by, they go, she's not doing that right, or I could do this better. And nobody's sticking around long enough to see what's actually happening.
I asked her how it was to be teaching elementary day in and day out during a pandemic.
Absolutely exhausting. They give you kids don't give you any space. I've had kids cough in my mouth.
I wish you guys could hear Becca laughing because we can see her.
And to jump into a different subject, like pandemic teaching. So last year I was teaching music. We switched after spring break to online, and then in June we went back into school, and my contract ended. And then I seriously sat and had a big long think in August and went, okay, so I'm in my mid-20s. I don't have any underlying health conditions, and I'm not going to be able to see my family for a while. Yeah, I can probably take a contract because if I get COVID, it's not likely that I'll die. And I saw it as a safer option to stick myself in one school as opposed to a TOC who is asked to go around to all the schools. And it's the fact that I've drafted a will this year. Like, not that I own a lot of things, but hey, someone will probably, now someone must love Matilda. You get told you're a priority. You get told you're going to get vaccines as soon as they're available, and then they put it off forever. If you wanted to vaccinate every teacher in the province, you could have done it in 3 days. It feels like we said, oh, thank you, teachers. You're doing such a great job of teaching in this pandemic.
I want to pop in and ask you to use your imagination, filling in what she said next. This has been a really difficult time to be a teacher, and walking the edge of maybe getting myself into trouble. I think there's been mass gaslighting happening, and it frustrates me. It frustrates me to imagine the long-term impacts that being forced to go to work while being told everything is fine in an environment that many have felt was really unsafe is going to have on our teachers. I shift gears again, and Tamara starts talking about her search.
I made a couple phone calls to the 2 recommended therapists to me, and both of them had like month-long wait lists. And I went, okay, great. Thank you for that. And it's also incredibly expensive, so I thought I would go out and look for some other options.
She reflects on other avenues and mentions an online platform that she's used before, but doesn't think is going to be the best option for her moving forward.
I've gone through that avenue before, but I found it just so exhausting because it felt like I hadn't been paired with someone totally successfully. Like I really liked the person I was talking to, but at the same time it was, you're not giving me any new information. I'm looking for new information.
Let's get into that a little bit. So your intake really was an interview that you did during a paid session.
Yeah.
This was a paid session. Okay. And when you say that it was a bit discouraging and that you weren't getting what you wanted, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Totally. So I've been to therapy before and I know a lot of strategies. That's really great. I also have a lot of strategies for kids. What I am looking for in a therapist right now is someone to help in those moments of panic. And I'm looking for ways to bring down my overall anxiety with extensive practices, because I have daily things that I do, but it's not feeling like enough anymore. And I think that's a pretty good mileage. I went to therapy the first time 2.5 years ago, and I'm just in the last 6 months, I've been feeling like I need more. So the part that I'm frustrated with is that it feels like I'm going to need to have 6 or 7 sessions with the same person before I feel like I'm going to be making any real progress. And the frustrating part about that is to pay $120 an hour 6 or 7 times to maybe get a therapist that works for you is a big financial commitment for something that isn't a guarantee. And I know it's important and a part of my health, but it's really hard.
How different would that feel if that cost was covered?
Oh my God, I'd have therapy every week. I'd call every Saturday morning. I'd be like, hey, dear, get your coffee. Let's go. I don't have a problem talking about my problems. I'm a very chatty person. It would be a total game changer for myself if I had access to counseling services like that. And I know it would change the game for a lot of teachers. A lot of people nobody's doing well.
I ask if anyone else has thoughts on what Tamara just shared.
It's hard to talk about like I'll feel comfortable in 6 sessions, and this is really expensive. That's a lot of pressure. How are you supposed to? I don't want to tell my life story on the first session, but well, I want to be able to afford it. I might just need to. Just only an hour? I've been alive for not that long. I got a lot of problems, and if I want to be specific and be able to talk, actually say my words instead of just skim it over like I've done with everything else, and actually get to the root of the problem. A lot of money.
All I'm saying is if you need it to stay alive, it should not cost anything.
Yeah.
All of the things that the government pays for is reactionary. And mental health services are kind of the same. It's all reactionary. It doesn't talk about anything preventative, which I think is ridiculous.
I think they all make good points. There's a lot of pressure when you do find someone you're going to work with, or you finally get benefit coverage to go speak to someone to get it out of the way as quickly as possible. But that's just not how things work. And at this point, it's not really a question anymore of whether you're going to struggle with mental health. For most of us, it's when. And that might mean we need to seriously start thinking about how to do things a bit differently. But I'll come back to my thoughts on that at the end of our episode. I asked Tamara if she has any final thoughts.
I think it's stupid that there is not a more concise and streamlined way to find therapists.
I do want to pop in and say that she's not actually negating the fact that we have an online registry for counselors or that there aren't services that are already trying to do parts of this for us.
What do you guys think that's about? Why is that?
It is a delayed gratification. You won't see the effects of free mental health care in your society for a while. Because 1, people have to know it's there. 2, people have to use it. And 3, it has to work.
Yeah.
And so if you suddenly gave free counseling to anybody who wanted it, who was over the age of 18, it would change so many lives, but it wouldn't be until later down the line that you would see, oh, unemployment is going down and high school dropout rates are going down. The societal payoff is too delayed for us to invest the money.
And I think that really comes back down to the fact that a lot of people will look at numbers and say, okay, we need to funnel our money into reactionary services instead of looking at how the preventative services could increase the quality of life for a lot of people.
There's a lot to think about there. We kept talking for a bit before we moved on to Jo. I started off by asking Jo how her search went. We brought the group up to speed at the same time because this process presented more challenges than we'd anticipated. She starts with tangible barriers.
So I started with Google searches, and it was really frustrating because you have to really be quite specific, and there's mass limitations.
She then mentions some financial barriers.
If you have, like an extra $100,000 sitting in your pocket, then yeah, we can help you. I literally had an email this morning that said, I don't know because of litigation whether or not I can help you, but, just pay this like $325 and then we can meet and have an intake. And I was like, are you out of your...
Obviously, that wasn't going to happen. Finally, we talk about some of the more surprising barriers that we hit, and I asked her to share what happened when her and I met to do our solo interview.
It was a mess.
Yeah, it was a mess, and we've had a little bit of time to reflect on that. What do you think happened?
Oh, well, so my coping mechanisms for things is to like shut everything down until I feel safe. and I haven't yet felt safe. So I'm not going to talk about things if I don't have a container to hold that.
That insight's profound. How many of us are automatically doing that? I then reflected on the fact that both of us were surprised in the process to realize that mentally, Jo hadn't yet identified with being a survivor of abuse, which is really common. And as we both realized that, Jo's search questions and experience with what we were doing changed. She was clear in her mind that she'd experienced emotional and financial abuse. But when she went to search for the supports that specifically address those things, this is what happened.
But when you type in, like if you type in, because my Google searches were fairly specific, as in counseling for emotionally abusive relationships, right? Or like leaving that. And the stuff that was coming up was more domestic violence, as in physical violence, right? Like they didn't really look at this like whole other dynamic. It talked about, like women's shelters or women's and children's shelters and things like that, but I don't fall into that particular category. So I found that either you have to have a great deal of money or you have to be at a place where you're like really, really desperate. And if you don't fall into either of those extreme categories, then you sort of fall through all the cracks.
That's wildly concerning. I then ask her what she thinks some of the challenges those of us leaving abusive relationships might face in looking for services.
So if you've just got Google, I think you're SOL, right? Like, so, yeah. And you have to be quite dedicated to figuring stuff out on your own. And I don't mean like figuring out your emotional state or capacity or any of that kind of stuff. You have to be quite assertive and like keep banging on doors in order for things to open up for you, which is not helpful. If you're already in a state where you're like in self-doubt or have issues with self-esteem or, like it's not a good fit.
I then asked her what happened that shifted her search.
Friday, Thursday, whatever day that was, when the RCMP reached out, I was like, that's it. Like somebody has to help me. If I just keep smashing on doors, then someone will answer. But to me, it's really sad that you have to get to a state where you're like, I'm literally in crisis, right? Before people will help you. Like that, to me, seems counterproductive.
Tamara, go ahead and jump in.
If you're taking the time to look and search for these supports,
clearly something's wrong.
Something's wrong. There's a gap. There's a need. It's not being filled.
There's a big gap. And something that I noticed that came up in that interview, Jo, was that there was almost like a resistance to the idea, even though that's what we were talking about, was being a survivor of abuse. There was a resistance to the idea that was even a category that you fell into. And so when we have services that are only available when people are in a really desperate situation, and they also have these really like intelligent protective mechanisms internally that come up where we are sort of like, we're protecting ourselves because we're only able to actually tolerate and accept what we can and actually support, which is what you talked about, having that container, right, to be able to process some of that stuff. When that's already in place, that really gets in the way of people being able to get help. How many of us have been in relationships where we see some of the same patterns occurring over and over again because there was no opportunity, there was no space to be able to process and sort some of that out. Most of us didn't realize that our home situations had a great deal of abuse when we look at the fact that a lot of us didn't get the chance to have basic boundaries. And that translates into all of your relationships. We don't know what we don't know.
Jo gets into more details about the mental barriers.
Well, the barrier is the acceptance part, right? Like actually identifying with that particular label, if you will.
She keeps talking and says she's refusing to do it. And for her, here's why.
One, because I don't really want the label. And two, it's processing all the emotional stuff that I am currently not willing to look at.
I asked what would happen if she was forced to take on that label.
I don't know, because I don't want to do it. And so I'm not sure what that would look like. I don't think it would change anything at all. My stuff is like, I'm not good at talking about feelings or any of that kind of thing. And so the feelings and the experiences, they're massive and they're draining. And to look at it is like a huge process. then I'm at a stage where I'm like, no, I don't have the mental capacity to do it. I have too many other things that are going on that actually need my full-on attention.
I then ask if anyone else resonates with what she just shared, and Tamara jumps right in.
I don't have the mental capacity, or like I don't have the time and the space to deal with these emotions because so many other things are pulling my attention. Like, that's every day. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, you said something really good in there, that the feelings were too massive. They were too big.
They're too big for what I can currently like deal with. Right.
How many people do you guys think that prevents from trying to access services in the first place?
Tons.
Yeah, me.
Yeah. I was gonna say me.
No, but seriously, like, what happens?
Like the time that it's gonna take me to do all this stuff, just for like a little tiny, it's just small. I'll just go for a walk instead. There's a better use of my time. Right there.
Especially when therapy can be tied to a specific trauma that you're trying to cope with, like grief or something where it's like, well, it's too soon, I can't deal with it. And then by the time you have the space to kind of look at those emotions, it's like, oh, well, that person died like a year ago. Do I really need to go to therapy for that anymore? And it's like, yes, you do. Especially if it's like a major person in your life. And it can be easier to squish down and pretend it's not there than to open up the can, because the more you squish down, the more compacted your problems are. And once you open it, everything from the beginning will come out. So,
and we're taught like to put things in compartments, compartmentalize things so that you can function, right, as a human being. And like, God forbid you decide not to do that, right? Or like you let your personal life interfere with your professional life or vice versa, or however. Like, we're just very, like, and boundaries are important. I'm not saying that they're not, but I just think there's a stage where it's like crazy, because now that I have had this like epiphany or whatever you want to call it, I'm like, great, but I can't deal with it because I have so much on my plate and I have to be functioning, like I have, and high functioning, right? I can't just zone out. So
homelessness is a huge issue in Victoria. My sibling and I just had this conversation. Sometimes having the space to be able to unpack in the first place, it's a huge privilege. Like, just getting past all the other mental blocks, being able to do that, you lose your job. Not like it's inherent because you shared and you lost your job, but opening up and not having the space or the time, like when you start to actually deal with some of these feelings, it gets in the way. I've had that experience over the last 2 years. You don't know how many times I've been nervous that I'm going to not be able to get something done and not be able to pay my rent because I lost my job. We don't have a way, and we can't talk about this. Like, actually talking about this stuff is not only considered shameful, it's like you'll just get fired, or at least that would be my assumption. That's what I've been operating out of. People don't care. Yeah, jump in.
I was just thinking about how, like, I've had to take time off of work before for mental health, but I had to use another medical excuse as to why I'm taking the time off, so I don't lose either seniority or the shifts that I was getting or any other number of things, because it feels like it's not important enough to take the time to, like, you know, like I think Tamara was saying, not cry every day after work. You know, having to rationalize it in any other way because you're concerned that you're going to lose your job by saying, hey, I need a mental health day, instead of like, you have to make up any other excuse to take that time off. And I think that's ridiculous.
Me too. I'm going to pop in again. I've definitely had times in the last 2 years where my feelings did seem too big to deal with. Part of that was because I didn't have strong enough emotional regulation skills to contain those feelings. It took everything in me just to keep breathing. Emotional regulation isn't something that a lot of us learned at home. Most of our parents didn't learn, and so they wouldn't have been able to show us. Think about whether or not sorrow and anger were things you could express at home, or fear. If the answer isn't yes, and it doesn't matter why,
You would have had to learn the skills to feel those feelings safely in your body somewhere else. It's not an opportunity a lot of us would have. We then connected emotional regulation to boundaries and how we can sometimes unintentionally normalize abusive behavior, and it'll have big consequences on our feelings later in life.
Well, and we can't teach what we didn't learn, and the truth of the matter is most of us didn't. And our parents didn't, which is like, I cannot imagine being in the position of having my kid come up to me at 25, 30 years old and go, hey, you know what? Actually, a lot of what happened when I was younger wasn't okay for me. And to have these conversations and finally get there and go, oh my God, but like, this is just what I grew up with. I had no idea. I didn't know. Right. And we were told, at least I was told that to just suck it up and that this was me being sensitive and it was in my head. Right. And when it comes to abuse, that word is a scary word. It's like the word fight. People hear the word fight and they're like, I think it's inherently a negative thing. And it's not necessarily, but that word abuse, if you were to ask, like, if we were to go around each of us and explain what we thought the definition of that word was, it probably wouldn't all be the same. There's a lot of like heat to that word. It's intense for a lot of people. And so when we stop to think about ourselves, especially when we've been in a situation for a long time, it's hard to imagine that it could have been that we think like that bad, or that's what was going on, or there's an incredible amount of shame. There's an incredible amount of shame that comes up. At least there has been for me, in acknowledging and recognizing that, I was in an abusive relationship.
I ask if anyone else has thoughts on that, and a few people nod. Becca starts sharing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think it's a really hard thing to like, you're like, oh, I acknowledge it, and then you're like, should I bring it up? Should I not? Would it help this person if I actually said something? Would it help our relationship and moving forward if I told them these kind of things? Are they gonna be like upset, or like, am I gonna hurt them by saying it? I gotta be able to figure out how to say it in a way that's gonna bring it up in the best possible way. I'm trying not to name names now. in my own, I was like, yeah, like just keep it vague. Keep it vague. But I mean, there are and there are hard conversations like I find it almost easier for me to have my own faults played upon me, just because, guys, I pride myself on my humility. And but I do find it easier for somebody to give me like my critique, or my like, you should maybe do this better or something, than like me maybe express my feelings. Like, so you hurt me, and it hurt, and please, could we work on this? That'd be nice. This is how you hurt me, and yeah, I'm working through now. I have to do a lot of work now to to fix that. So yeah.
At this point, I jump back into the conversation and ask Becca to elaborate on something specific that she shared.
I'm wondering, when you say that it's harder to share with somebody that they've hurt you, it's harder to admit that and to share it with them. What do you think that's about?
Well, it's definitely for me because I don't want to hurt anybody. I don't want to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I think uncomfortable, and I really don't want to hurt anyone. I think that comes up in like the everybody kind of does things wrong. Also, I think a little bit like little Becca child of, I just want friends, and if I'm nice, and people can make, everybody's laughing with me. Sometimes they're laughing at me, and I'll just think they're laughing with me. I'll laugh along, even though I'll cry later.
I'm going to throw it quickly over to Sierra because she raised her hand, and then Tamara, you can. Oh, no. All right, Tamara, you got it.
I have a question for you, Becca, if that's okay.
Sure.
I'm wondering if part of the reason why it's harder for you to tell people that you're hurt, have you had people react poorly to that before?
Yes.
Because I, in a previous relationship, when I tried to communicate that my feelings were hurt, it was explosive reaction. And then I was left alone to rationalize how it was my fault. And then it was told to me how my feelings being hurt was my fault. Now, that's an extreme scenario, but...
No, you're touching on something really, really important. I'm just going to say this really quick because what you just made me think of is all of these kids, whose poor parents are just stressed and whatever's going on, who made me sure that they're upset about something if they have the courage to do that in the first place, and their parent explodes or somebody explodes, and then they're left trying to rationalize and make sense of this person who takes care of them and cares about them blowing up like that, right? And as adults, we can rationalize this away. As kids, we can't. That becomes really frightening.
And it really can be. There's a lot for us to think about while we move on to Sierra's search. Here's what she shared.
I felt like the battle was over before it even began. I felt like I had been actively trying to access services for such a long time that by the time I actually had to start looking, I felt like I had already tried all the avenues. Okay, I've been struggling with this stuff for a really long time. I don't look like I'm struggling. I have just enough mental health issues that I need the services, but not bad enough to actually need them immediately or like go to a crisis line. And then I think kind of what Joe said of like when there's so much going on, it makes accessing services so much more difficult because you're just trying to get by with your day. Like you're just trying to get by into your next thing. And if you're unable to make that time for yourself, then there's nothing there.
That's a hard place for anyone to be, and she's discouraged. When I ask her what the most challenging part of this was, she shares something pretty important.
I think the most frustrating thing is already feeling like it's a lost battle before it's even begun. And I think that stops access for so many other people too. And I feel like I'm a resourceful person, but there's so many people who think that they're like just okay enough, but they need the services, but then they don't feel like they're not okay enough. Like I need services, but at this point it feels like the quickest thing to get me into anywhere is going to be a crisis line, but then I'm only going to talk to one person. From the supports that I found on either government websites or the university, like it's not a long-term solution. And then even if you are able to access services, it's kind of like we were talking about, it's like 6 sessions, 10 sessions. Like if you're a human, and especially in a pandemic, especially with everything else, you're going to need more than those sessions to even start telling your story at all. When I was in counseling, I was seeing my counselor for like 6 months. And I didn't get all the way through anything. Like I didn't even get halfway through. And that's just how it is. And I think that's the way it is for a lot of people. And then when you're constantly seeing new counselors or new people, then you have to go through that trauma over and over again. And I think that's ridiculous. It's like, why would we not just make this accessible so that we don't need to keep re-traumatizing ourselves?
That's a really good question. Everyone's had a chance to share, and we've definitely talked about some unexpected stuff. Remember how I said none of this was scripted and we hadn't given anyone directions on how to go about accessing services? I finally get a chance to ask them how they decided where to start, and this is what they said.
I clicked on the email from the lady from HR.
I Googled, googly Google. Yep. Counselors near you.
How many of you reached out or spoke to people that you knew?
To look for a therapist?
Yeah, I think Tamara's tone says it all.
I did reach out to the person I had spoken to last summer, like the counselor that I had spoken to last summer, for resource information.
I did not. And looking back, probably should have.
At this point, I remind them that we didn't expect them to do something specific. We'd actually thrown them in with no instructions and asked them to try and figure it out. So their responses were totally on point and revealing something pretty important.
There isn't a roadmap on how to do this. We don't talk about how to actually figure out what kinds of services we need or how to get to them. We know, like, in the ether, they exist.
I think that's a really accurate statement because, like, I think unless you're like acutely aware of other mental health services or have somebody else experiencing them or like have somebody who is actually able to find those resources to be able to even recommend to you, the easiest or most accessible would be Google. But then even with that, they have to be so specific to even get anywhere.
It's not like walking into a mall where there's so many options and you can kind of just figure out what it was you were looking for while you're walking around. The internet isn't like that. You need to know exactly what it is you're searching for.
It's like your options are either you stand in the middle of the desert and you hope that you walk the right direction and stumble into some mental health services. You get thrown into the ocean where you got to find that one specific drop of water. Like, there's either nothing or way too much that it's impossible to sort through.
She makes a good point. Not only does it seem impossible to sort through, most of us don't know the first thing about how to start. Unlike they shared earlier, when you're already in a state of crisis, just trying to start can feel so overwhelming. Lots of people give up. So where do we go from here? I'll share my thoughts on that in a bit. As our time together was coming to an end for the evening, I asked the women to reflect on a few things. The process of coming into a circle and sharing the way we did can be pretty special. Using that model of coming together throughout an entire program was profound. I asked them about that experience and then what they believed might be coming next. Remember when I said we leave no one behind? At this part in the evening and in the process, part of how we make sure that that law is honored is by carving out time for each person to speak. David taught me that that space is yours and you decide how you'll use it, and you can always choose not to. Becca starts us off.
I think it was really nice to be a part of like a circle. It felt more comfortable, I think, talking about this stuff with like rules, but also like comfiness to be able to talk about it. Felt supported by each and every one of you. That might be because we're cool, but that also might be just because everything was kind of set for it. So that was kind of nice. I think society has some things to work on. I think even though the pandemic has been really hard on things, I really do think it's going to get people to start thinking about how things are run a little bit differently. Maybe not for everything. I'm especially looking at the teachers. I'm like, obviously they didn't think about that. But I think there are some things within society that there will be ripple effects, I think, out from the pandemic or maybe around mental health, about accessibility, about like, hey, we ran the government. We ran it from home. We did great. Maybe we can work from home more times. That'd be nice for us. And I think that might ripple effect into other places. And I'm hoping that ripple effects down into mental health because I think there needs to be a change. And I think there was a severe spotlight on it in 2020, 2021, probably 2022. So, yeah.
Next, I pass it to Natasha.
Yeah, kind of mirroring what Becca said, the structure of the circle is nice in that I've always been really bad with boundaries in every aspect of my life. So to have structure set up, it's lovely. It's kind of freeing, and I think we talked about that throughout the evening, in that it almost feels like there's more freedom in structure than without. Going forward, I always laugh about this. Becca put it well. I don't remember how she put it. I just remember the fact that she put it well. Something about, yeah. We all know mental health is a thing. Now what? I don't really have anything too insightful about it. I just know that maybe it's the circles I'm in. I'm quite open with speaking about my struggles. Most of the people I'm close with are open in talking about it, and we all collectively acknowledge that that is indeed a part of who we are. And when I ask how you're doing, I actually mean, how are you doing? So I think going forward, me as an individual, I'll be thinking more about that higher level of, what do we do now? And how can I support people? But most importantly, well, not most importantly, somewhere in that realm, I should also take care of myself. Oxygen masks and what have you.
I pass it to Tamara next.
I really like this circle process because I've found it to be really easy for myself to share the things that I'm thinking and the feelings I'm having, and someone will say something and I'll go, oh yeah, that makes me think of this thing. And it's been really great. I really thrive in this kind of circumstance. So honestly, thanks for doing that for me, everybody. And then what do we do next? If I was in charge, we would spend so much money on public health services, and it would be an extension, and basically all of these lower thresholds of like, okay, you've got to get this bad before we can help you. All of those thresholds would rise. However, I don't run the world and I don't have all the money. So what I think we should be doing next is, instead of the days talking about mental health, is that you build it into practice, that you make it a part of everyday workplaces, and you make it a part of the curriculum. And like, they say that you're supposed to talk about it, but the curriculum in BC is only a couple years old. Like, it's going to take a while. But the difference you would be able to see if companies were required to do things like that would be astronomical. That's what I think we should be doing. I think we should be taking it, if we're not going to dump the money into the public system, then we got to make everybody else deal with it. I personally think we should dump the money into the public system, but no one's ever a big fan when the government spends all their money. So
Joe shares next.
I always found the circle process really interesting, and it's really good practice for me because I have to say stuff. It's just not my biggest strong suit. So it's really good. I enjoy it, and it's a safe space, and it's been educational, and I feel very privileged to be part of this. Where do we go from here? Yeah, I don't know. I thought I'm somewhat skeptical because it seems like a huge, huge issue. And there are lots of different avenues to have a look at. But I like the idea that Tamara was saying of like making it into an actual practice for yourself. And and for me to lead by example is usually the easiest thing for me to do. So that would be my takeaway.
Finally, Sierra shares.
I always really like the circle process. I think it's really nice to be able to hear from everybody and reflect on how their experiences maybe mirrors or is different from your own, and like where you can either work on or reflect on. And it's just, I come up with more ideas like, oh, I'm thinking about that. Oh, I'm thinking about that. But where do we go from here? I'm very much like Tamara, where it's like, maybe we should be putting more money into public health. However, realistically, I know that that's not a thing right now. But I think also maybe taking mental health more seriously, like from more of a corporation standpoint, or even just like a business standpoint. Because like I get emails and they're like, let's take care of your mental health. And it's like, do yoga, take a bubble bath. I'm like, maybe I just am struggling to brush my teeth. Like, and that's where I'm at. I don't need to like take a bubble bath. I need help to be able to brush my teeth. Like, those are two very different things, even though they may be under the same self-care bubble. I think it's maybe putting a more serious spin on what taking care of your mental health actually is.
I'm really surprised and inspired by our conversation. There's so much to think about. And as I've been putting the pieces of this podcast together, I keep thinking about what David said. Plant the seeds of trees whose shade you'll never sit under. I'm wondering what he'd think of the forest that's growing now. This idea of regeneration, experiences, skills, ways of thinking that we pass on through living our lives. I think when we begin to show up differently, the world around us begins to change as well. We're all in relation, and so it doesn't really have much of a choice. When we come together and hold space for each other, not telling each other what to do or what to think, but just be with each other, that in and of itself has a profound effect on our sense of isolation, our self-esteem, and our worth. We listen to others and we let them see us. This process of being in circle and supporting each other through trying to access services has been a community building process. We didn't do it alone. Earlier I said I would share my thoughts on next steps moving forward. Here's what I think and what's next for Let's Talk Access. What is the solution? I'm not sure on a larger scale, but from our small corner, we're going to try to tackle this with education. Do you remember how I said that education, it's a process of drawing out that which was already within? Well, information isn't going to be enough. We've got to go back to those 3 group laws: goal, leadership, no one left behind. Next season, we'll set out to create our own maps to navigate mental health, starting by breaking things down and then building them up by assessing the knowledge for ourselves. That determination of what's relevant, it'll be firmly in your hands. That's education, giving you the info and supporting you in trusting yourself to build what's best for you. I'll hold that second law, at least the part about keeping us on track and doing everything I can not to leave people behind. We'll bring in experts to tackle topics and share their lived experiences in the field to help you determine your own approach. And that third law of leaving no one behind, we're going to build things up sequentially and find ways to apply them step by step. David taught me a lot in our time together, but arguably one of the most important things I learned, he didn't tell me. He let me discover for myself. I already had everything I needed inside of me. I just needed the right environment, support, and tools to grow. I was always meant to meet my own potential, but we're all interconnected. No one does it alone. We live in a time when it's idealized to imagine that we do. We're told that people make it happen themselves. What gets forgotten is like that seed that becomes an oak. Without the earth, rain, and sun, that tree would never grow. But the intelligence of what was possible was always inside of it. It just can't happen alone. We need access to knowledge and tools, but we also need access to each other, our shared experiences, our voices, and our witnessing. It's not for anyone to tell you what to do. That won't draw you out. This is education. That determination is in each of us. We need each other to grow. So next season, we're going to set out and see what's possible. That option of choice and support, it's powerful. So while I have no idea if this will be the solution to barriers in access, I'm ready to see what happens. This has been your host, Krista, and thank you for joining us on this first season of Let's Talk Access. I want to take a moment and say thank you to a few people, our wonderful friends and community that made this project possible. Thank you to Becca Elliott, who not only helped develop the arc of this story, but kept me and our team on task. Together we ate a lot of sushi, crafted script, and spent hours laughing over anime breaks between writing. Becca's got a pretty great TikTok channel, @TheElliottMoose, that's double T, and if you want a good laugh, you should definitely check her out. To Natasha Newman, who brought laughter, discernment, and creativity to our project while also managing our social media presence. To Tamara, Sierra, and Joe for their vulnerability, their voices, and dedication to making this story happen. I also want to thank Tara Jean Stevens, award-winning podcaster behind Heaven Bent, for her ongoing support. TJ was warm, honest, and behind us, everything you need in a mentor. She offered her time and her insight, and this podcast wouldn't have been possible without her. I want to thank Zana Zukowicz for the beautiful and original music you hear in this series. To the friends and family who vetted hours of audio, listened to me worry, and gave their feedback on our project, thank you. And to TELUS and StoryHive, who made this opportunity possible to not only me, but an entire cohort of new podcasters. I think it's rare to have an opportunity to get funding, training, and support. They did that for all of us.
Living's a reminder of how far you've come. Here's suppressing silence, you may be feeling numb. Breaking down and crying, 'cause all the love is gone. Don't forget you're strong enough to hold on, hold on. Forget what they said, hold on. Only you know your head, look to the future and see all the brighter golden years ahead. Find your courage, replace memories running rampant with your dread.
And finally, a big thank you to everyone listening. From everyone who made Let's Talk Access possible. See you next season.